Peak Human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak 人間
Ketones.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Season 5 is here. I took a short break to collect some interviews and put out a few episodes of the new Sapien podcast. You can check that out on YouTube or any podcast app. It's a more casual and conversational show we shoot on video and audio with Dr. Gary in our medical clinic Evolve Healthcare in Los Angeles. We've started to take on more patients to our weight loss, chronic disease management, and Sapien lifestyle programs. You can find out more at sapien.org/programs. We offer one-off consultations, physician-supervised weight loss through insurance, and the 3-month Sapien program with one-on-one diet and lifestyle coaching. This is offered in the clinic in Los Angeles or remotely. Again, that's sapien.org/programs. Okay, this episode is jam-packed with information, so get ready to take some notes. Dr. Ben Bikman is a legend. He's a professor of pathophysiology and a biomedical scientist whose research focuses on the molecular mediators of obesity and its co-morbidities. Employing cell autonomous to whole body systems, his lab's main efforts explore the intimate associations between the metabolic and immune systems. He also is a world-class presenter and has some fantastic lectures on YouTube. I highly recommend watching them, and links will be included in the show notes. Dr. Bikman is really one of the foremost minds on human metabolism in the world. I'm honored to be able to speak with him and share this episode. I'll quickly give a shout out to Christy and the super comprehensive show notes she does. You can get access to them by supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/peakhuman. Throwing a few bucks there allows me to keep doing this show and creating content of all kinds. If you can't spare any cash, please give this podcast a review or even just tap the 1 through 5 star rating on the Apple Podcast app. This would be super helpful. It bumps up the show and the results and gives it a bit more cred. Appreciate all the complimentary reviews so far. It helps keep me going. Also, if you like meat and eat it to survive as a human being, why not get top quality grass-finished meat from nosetotale.org? This is my company, so you'll be supporting me and a Texas ranch. Our signature products are ground beef, pork, and buffalo with all the organs mixed in. You can get your liver, kidney, heart, and spleen without having to get out the meat grinder and while enjoying a very delicious burger. With a little seasoning, it tastes beautiful. I think it's the best way to get all these amazing nutrients. Our pork and chicken is actually extra special. We spend quite a bit more money giving them a proprietary high omega-3 feed that translates into super high omega-3 meat. The omega-6 omega-3 ratio is insane. It's less than 2.1. Compare it to conventional pork, which is about 20-1, and conventional chicken, which is about 24-1. This is much better for you than normal stuff, obviously. Chicken and pork usually get a bad rap, and maybe that's well-deserved for conventionally grown versions. This is a different ballgame here, folks. If you want to mix it up from the wonderful staple that is red meat, this is where it's at. So let's get to this episode with Dr. Ben Bikman. We talk about brown fat versus white fat, how this relates to the calorie in, calorie out model of obesity, insulin, glucagon, and why protein doesn't cause problems in a low glucose context, longevity, MTOR, body composition, and gaining muscle, to name a few. He covers so many interesting and valuable things. I don't want to hold it up any longer. Please enjoy the show. Dr. Ben Bikman, we started talking and I just thought we should record and get this captured. How's it going?
I am doing well, Brian. Thanks for the opportunity to talk all things metabolism.
Well, yeah, I know you love talking about this stuff. It's fun to not be in the lab and, get to talk to people about it. But that's actually what we just started talking about is that I noticed you're such a great speaker. And I just did my first speaking engagement and it was hard. I was in front of people. I was nervous. You do so well. And I didn't know you actually lecture in front of students a lot. That's how you hone your skills.
Yeah, well, I am insistent on that. Like we discussed a moment ago, if I do have any skill, if I do have any talent in that regard, it really has been honed by having to keep a really large group of undergraduates engaged, wanting to learn, wanting to pay attention. I'm constantly competing with Instagram and Facebook on their phones or laptops. And it is, of course, largely motivated by my genuine desire to want them to learn something and maybe perhaps just to feel like I'm not wasting my time in front of them. But that does definitely force you to look at your talk in a way really two things that I'm always trying to get out of a talk, or the goals I'm trying to realize when I've presented a talk. Was it engaging and entertaining, or entertaining and educational, I guess? And the combination of those I would consider to be engaging. If you really want to hone those skills, Brian, find 150 21-year-olds and make them give you your attention for 2 hours at a time.
Well, maybe I'll just show up at UCLA and start doing that.
Yeah.
So yeah, these presentations are amazing. Everyone should go on YouTube and find the low carb Breck, and then what was the other one? Was it low carb down under?
Low carb down under was kind of like the leading group over the low carb Denver and low carb Breckenridge, and so I think it sometimes gets housed under their name.
Okay, that one had the most. It had like 460,000 views, which is so amazing for a video about metabolism,
Oh yeah, I'm dumbfounded. I'm thrilled, but I'm surprised. But delighted, really.
So yes, we're going to go through a lot of this stuff, and we'll do an interactive version of these presentations because not everyone sits and watches stuff like this all day like I do. But how did you get so into this? How did you get so into the metabolism thing?
Right, yeah. So my undergraduate and then my master's degree was exercise physiology. At the time, I was just really, you're always told just do something you love and there'll always be a job for you. That's the kind of advice I got from my dad. Mm-hmm. And as I was an undergraduate thinking about what I really enjoyed, it was actually learning more about the body, particularly in the context of exercise. How does the body adapt to that kind of stimulus, that challenge? Challenging a muscle or challenging the cardiorespiratory system. And then as I was getting towards the end of my master's degree, I stumbled on this research that was already a couple years old at the time out of Harvard, looking at how adipose tissue is a hormone tissue or an endocrine tissue. It would secrete hormones, both good and bad, or maybe to clarify, both anti-inflammatory and pro-inflammatory. And that was just fascinating to me. And that got me curious about what these pro-inflammatory hormones from the adipocytes or the fat cells, what they were doing to the rest of the body. And it was apparent in that early research that it was part of what was causing insulin resistance, which was a condition I was only very marginally familiar with. In fact, that might even be putting it generously. Mm-hmm. But that started my interest in, rather than looking at the body as it was adapting to something like exercise, I became more curious about looking how the body adapts to fat mass. As its fat cells are growing, what is the body trying to do to maintain homeostasis or an optimal function? Unfortunately, it's not able to do much that's good in those instances, but that is what got me started more specifically looking at a disease state, specifically insulin resistance, whereas I had been looking at a very physiological or healthy state in the context of exercise. But I was able to follow that up with working in a wonderful lab at East Carolina University under the mentorship of a man named Linus Dome. And he was just a very, very good insulin resistance scientist. And then I was fortunate enough to be accepted into a lab at Duke, not Duke in Durham, North Carolina, oddly enough. Duke has a medical campus in Singapore, on the other side of the world in Southeast Asia. And so moved my little family and to that part of the world and worked there with Duke for 3 years before I got hired, where I am now at BYU. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so great. And then, so you're still at BYU, professor of pathophysiology and biomedical science?
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. I'm in the physiology and developmental biology department, and the class I teach is pathophysiology.
Very cool. And then insulin resistance, I mean, that thing is just at the root of everything, right?
Yeah, it really is. And even that was a bit of an evolution. When I started studying it, I thought it was only relevant to diabetes. And indeed, type 2 diabetes is at its core a disease of insulin resistance. It overwhelmingly, if not, always at the beginning, if not throughout the entire course of the disease, there is too much insulin. The beta cells of the pancreas are just working like gangbusters, producing this insulin, but the body's just not responding to it as much as it was before. And so that's partly why it's making more. I thought it was just relevant to type 2 diabetes. And then it wasn't until 9 years ago when I was hired as a professor and started teaching this class about disease. That's what pathophysiology is. It's basically how the organ systems work when they're not working. So I have a lot of pre-med and nursing students. When I started teaching that class, I felt so ill prepared because I didn't have a background in clinical, pathology or pathophysiology at all. I had a background in physiology, but not when things don't work well. But I was familiar enough that I felt up to the task. But it made me want to really lean on a topic where I could speak with a great deal of authority, namely insulin resistance. And so whenever I could, in the early, year or two of teaching that class, I would ask myself, all right, well, I'm talking about fatty liver disease, the most common liver disorder in the world. That have anything to do with insulin resistance? Because it sure would be nice to show a few papers at the end, just so I can really end that lecture off on a high note, and it sound like I really know what I'm talking about. And sure enough, there was, hundreds, thousands of manuscripts published on that topic. And then I would get to something like cognitive disorders and Alzheimer's disease. And I would ask myself that question again. And sure enough, there were thousands of published manuscripts. And the more I kept coming across or covering certain disease states relevant generally to specific tissues like the brain or the muscle and bones or the skin or even fertility like gonad function, insulin resistance always would rear its ugly head. I kept finding it in all of these instances. And that was the beginning of me appreciating just what I was studying, that it had a context well outside of type 2 diabetes. And that also became part of my conviction even to get involved in social media about 3 years ago at this point. It really was because I thought, this is the elephant in the room. The more we just look at all of these chronic diseases as distinct problems requiring distinct separate medications with their separate side effects, the more we're really not going to address the problem, and we're just going to be addressing the symptoms of what in most instances is one single disorder, namely insulin resistance. So when the clinician can look at their hypertensive, pre-diabetic, overweight patient, and rather than just give them an anti-hypertensive medication, give them an anti-hyperglycemic medication, give them some other medication, for their IBS or whatever it may be, if they can just say, wait a minute, all of these have one common core to a degree at least. Before we give you these medications, let's maybe try a month of just a lifestyle intervention. Let's try to bring your insulin down through normal lifestyle means and see what that does. And sure enough, certainly with regards to excess weight and excess blood pressure or high blood pressure, boy, if someone just starts to bring down their insulin, those things start to just resolve themselves very, very rapidly.
It's amazing. Yeah, I'm doing this with my partner, Dr. Gary, in our clinic in LA and seeing it. It's just hard that not everyone has time or the capacity or the knowledge about this to do this. And
that's right. Yeah.
Well, so how did you get into low carb world? Because I know you weren't. I'm scared that I'm only talking to low carb people, and it's we're in this echo chamber. But you just came to this naturally. It's not like you're like, hey, I'm going to be a low carb person, or the meat industry paid me money, I'm going to do this.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It was organic, and in fact, it was a little painful. It was a little uncomfortable because I had been as much in the camp of low fat, low calorie as anyone, certainly when I worked as a personal trainer, which I absolutely hated. And I hope I never have to do again. But mind you, I'll do anything to provide for my family. So if I have to be a personal trainer again, I will, but man, I hated it. But the more I was appreciating how relevant insulin resistance is in the context of non-infectious chronic diseases, the more I realized that the best way to improve insulin sensitivity is to lower the insulin. And to give your listeners some sort of context there, insulin resistance is a disease where there is too much insulin. And indeed, part of the insulin resistance is caused because there's too much insulin. It creates this vicious cycle. But if someone is living a lifestyle where their insulin is chronically elevated, that will cause insulin resistance. And if that sounds a little strange, I submit that it really is everywhere around us. It is a fundamental biological principle. If there is too much of a stimulus, the system will reduce its sensitivity to that stimulus. This can be as something like caffeine exposure. I don't drink very much caffeine, and I remember training for my first marathon with another PhD student who, his name was Dan, super guy. He would drink a lot of coffee, and we started kind of experimenting with these caffeinated little gel packs. I would take one, every 7 or 8 miles, and he would take one every, 2 or 3. He just needed more of it to get that same response that I was getting. And so because he'd been so chronically exposed to caffeine, he needed more of it to get the same response. The same thing goes with insulin. The chronically elevated levels of insulin have reduced the body's sensitivity to insulin. And the best thing you have to do, just like if someone wants to reboot their sensitivity to caffeine, they have to kind of fast from the caffeine almost, or just reduce how much they're exposing themselves to. The same goes with insulin. So once I appreciated, I guess it was sort of sequential, and to just kind of make it perfectly clear, because I'm really kind of going on about it. But if insulin resistance is relevant to every chronic disease, we have to resolve the insulin resistance. If one of the main causes of insulin resistance is the excess insulin or the hyperinsulinemia, the best way to reverse course, let alone prevent it, is to reduce the insulin. It was that conclusion. I had long been an advocate of reducing insulin, and then it was kind of the practical realization that to really lower insulin in a long-term condition or long-term setting, low carb just becomes the low-hanging fruit. It is the easiest strategy. Now, I am not at all claiming low carb is the only way to go. Nope. Someone can be very smart about intermittent fasting. Someone can be smart about just the type of carbs they're eating. There are, after all, some vegan, even vegetarian, or I should say vegetarian, even vegan low carb individuals. But of course, in that case, when everything you're eating is sort of in that house of carbohydrate as a macronutrient, you just have to be really smart about selecting the carbohydrates that have the highest nutrient to sugar ratio. And generally, if someone's eating real food, which really is fruits and vegetables, they can do that just fine. And so if I ever have a talk with a vegetarian, and I'm decidedly not a vegetarian, and I have some pretty strong feelings about vegan living as well that I won't get into, but what I try to focus on, perhaps just the diplomat in me, is the common ground, which is in both instances, whether it's a low carb, even to the point of ketogenic, or whether it is a vegan diet that's trying to lower insulin, what they should have in common is that they're both avoiding processed foods. And in that case, that to me is the really strong common ground between any of these diets that can be so in opposition philosophically to each other. Really, at the end of the day, I just want to know, is the diet lowering your insulin? It is? Okay, great. And the fact is, if a person is in ketosis by adhering to a low carb diet or a diet that is sufficiently low in starches, then you know their insulin is low. This is a bit of a shift in topic, so I won't go too far on it. But if someone's making ketones, you know their insulin is low. It becomes a nice metric to determine how am I doing with regards to controlling my insulin. Are my ketones up? Yep, then I know my insulin's low, because you can't make ketones if insulin's high.
Well, I definitely want to get into that kind of stuff. And everything you're saying is so awesome. I love to talk about that. There's many different ways to do things. We don't have to all be in this low carb world, but when you're talking about the basic physiology, it's just the carbs produce more insulin, and especially the refined ones. So, it's not like we're talking crazy talk here, or we're like some zealots, or we just decided we hate carbs. It's funny what you hear about us from the opposite side.
Yeah, and I've been a recipient of some of that ire of people that just assume they know what I think. They fill in a lot of their own gaps, and which I, of course, resent. But even the most dogmatic dietitian has to admit that of the 3 macronutrients in the diet, fat, protein, carbohydrate, one of them has the greatest insulin spike, carbohydrate. There's absolutely no debating that. And one of them is indeed absolutely unnecessary for humans. There is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Now, I'm not saying thus we should all be carnivore. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying, how can we feel good about promoting a diet as so many entities, so many bodies, governing bodies do, that pushes so heavily a paradigm wherein you are spiking your insulin the most and you are eating the most of the one food you actually don't have a biological need for.
It's crazy. It's absolutely
It is
crazy.
crazy.
I mean, it hurts my head every day. And so I'm making a movie about it. Too bad we didn't get you in the film. Maybe we'll get you in the second one because you have all this great information. You're becoming my favorite person ever. The more we talk.
Good. Well, that's science. It's a testament to your love of science. Attaboy.
Well, yeah, I was a mechanical engineer to start off my life.
Good for you.
Yeah. So, okay, yeah, we're going to start from the beginning. I love this foundational principles and your look at root cause and all that stuff. So we'll do the same thing. So you talked about carbs and fat and protein, carbs being non-essential. Let's talk about more of this. Like what happens when you only eat fat and protein and like gluconeogenesis, and let's just kind of like move on through your presentations.
Sure. Well, geez, at this point I've given too many to, but yeah. So if we kind of kept that train of thought going, and I'll just rely on you to kind of bounce us around as needed. But yeah, so there are such things as essential fats. There are such things as essential amino acids. We know this. And wonderfully, those are also the two macronutrients that have little to no effect. And the little comes in the context of protein. There are a few factors to consider when we want to explore the degree to which protein does increase insulin. With fat, when someone eats pure fat, there is no bump on insulin. That does not register with regards to the beta cells in the pancreas. They do not release insulin in response to that. And that is part of the power of a low-carb, high-fat diet where, in fact, this is almost a shift in topic, but I'm going to go unless you pull me back. So a lot of all of this, if I'm kind of pulling in your listeners to look at human physiology the way I do, or human health, which is attempt to control insulin as much as possible, you can look at something called the insulin to glucagon ratio. And that is used classically as to define the fed or the fasted state. There is work from a man named George Cahill decades ago, and more work from Roger Unger. Just some incredible studies of these legendary metabolic scientists. And one of the talks I gave a couple years ago was sort of an ode to that research from these legends. But if we look at the insulin to glucagon ratio, that is really the definition, or we use that to define the fed or the fasted state. And glucagon is one of the hormones that act in opposition to insulin. And there are more than one, but this one is generally the main one that we consider, partly because it's also insulin's just next door neighbor. It's released from the alpha cells of the pancreas, so literally right next to where the insulin is being produced. So if we look at insulin, one of insulin's main actions, and I do emphasize one of its main actions, it does thousands of things depending on the cell type. But one of insulin's main actions is to lower blood glucose. If blood glucose is getting too high, insulin will come in and push that from the blood into the cells of the body. And we need that to happen. If blood glucose stays too high for too long, we can die. It can result in a non-ketotic coma, or basically would make the body urinate so much by pulling the glucose into the urine and pulling the water into the urine that we would die from hypovolemia. So we have to resolve that blood glucose spike very, very quickly. And thank heavens insulin does that very well. So if insulin's main job is to lower blood glucose, glucagon's main job is to increase blood glucose. And so that insulin to glucagon ratio should be low in a fasted state. Insulin is low. Glucagon is relatively higher because glucagon is mobilizing energy. It is telling fat cells, it's telling the liver, hey, start releasing some fat, start releasing glucose because I'm not eating, so I need you guys to feed the body. Glucagon will do that. It will signal that. Let's mobilize the energy because we are fasting. In contrast, of course, insulin wants to store the energy. It's telling the body, hey, we've just consumed. We just now have an excess of energy, so pull it in and lock it all away. Get it out of the blood where it's not doing any good and can potentially harm us, and let's just load it into the cells of the body. And so let's store things. And so when we're fasting, we don't want to be storing energy, of course, during a fast. We need to be mobilizing it. And so insulin is low. In contrast, glucagon is high. So the insulin to glucagon ratio is going to be low in a fasted state. In contrast, of course, in a fed state, so right after we've eaten, the insulin to glucagon ratio will be quite high. In fact, it will be several times, multiples higher than it was during a fasted state. But what's interesting during a low carb, high fat diet is we're nourishing the body, because you can't fast forever, of course. As much as I'm an advocate of intermittent fasting, and I am, if people are being smart about it, but at some point they have to end the fast. They just can't starve. If we look at health in the context of the insulin to glucagon ratio, and I really strongly submit we should, and the evidence supports it, then transitioning from a fast into a state where you are nourishing the body and yet not really changing the insulin to glucagon ratio, it's a modest change in a low carb diet, then it's closer to the fasted ratio than it is to the fed ratio. So in that case, it's kind of a cool state. In fact, that same scientist, George Cahill, he referred to low carb diets as, what do we call them? High calorie starvation diets. Which I think is a kind of a clever way of describing basically what I'm going on about.
Funny, yeah,
which is you're nourishing the body. You actually are taking in energy, which you have to do at some point, but it's like the body is still fasting. You're still moving all the energy around.
Yeah, and just to make sure people understand that fasted state is a good state. A lot of good things happen. I mean, a lot of health, you can just look at even just a simple ratio of how long people are in the fasted compared to the fed state.
Yeah. So one of the greatest benefits of a fasted or intermittent fasting is not only going to be, of course, just the reducing risk of multiple diseases, because you're controlling insulin, and insulin is indeed relevant to virtually every chronic disease, but you're also going to be, hopefully, the evidence indicates or hints at this idea that you'll be promoting greater autophagy, and that tends to be, or is looked at generally as one of the solutions to aging well.
Yeah, cellular repair and mitophagy, even repairing mitochondria. So yeah, there's just tons of good things that happen when you're in this fasted state, and most people in America are rarely in the fasted state.
Yeah. In fact, they are almost constantly in a fed state. You think about the average individual, what they're told, and they're doing what they're told. They're eating a high carb diet, and they're eating very high carb, and they're eating food every 2 hours or so. They're told eat high carb and eat 6 meals a day. And that's just a wonderful way to ensure that insulin is elevated every waking moment. In other words, it's terrible.
How did we get it so wrong? It seems like a joke.
Yeah, it's terrible. We can only speculate, frankly, and what kind of vested interests there were. And I'm not enough of an authority to even really go down that road, but we sure got it wrong.
Yeah, well, I am making a movie about it, so I do know about all these things, but I tend to think it's not conspiratorial. It's just like it happened and vested interest took over. But
that's probably a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
Right. It's like we just got some things wrong and then it's kind of snowballed. Well, okay. So I want to talk about individual numbers. You're kind of doing well at being high level, and then we can dive in. But looking at insulin to glucagon ratio and the actual numbers and looking at it in different dietary contexts.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Unfortunately, when I gave that talk in Breckenridge, it was using the numbers from Roger Unger's work from decades ago, but our ability to detect insulin and glucagon has risen orders of magnitude. Our sensitivity is so much better with the tests that we have. So the actual ratio doesn't even necessarily fit with the numbers that I gave, just because as we've been doing a follow-up in our lab, and we've got some really cool stuff that I'm hoping to have enough data to present my next low carb Denver talk. But we have people just consuming distinct macronutrients, so pure fat, pure protein, pure starch, and then looking at the changes in the insulin to glucagon ratio. And the numbers are just way different because in particular, well, like I said, we can detect insulin at far, far better values than they could, 30 or 40 years ago. And the same goes with glucagon. But let's just make it nice. So let's just say if someone is in a fasted state, has an insulin to glucagon ratio of 1, then when they are in a American diet, high carb, fed state, that will go up to around 8 or 9 or even 10.
Wow.
So in contrast, that's much, pretty substantial increase. In contrast, if someone eats and it is a low carb
your
diet,
presentation, obviously, there's a big compared to the fasted state.
Right, that's right.
Since you were presenting on about 4, but now you're saying with our new data.
So that's right. Now that I'm actually doing these studies on my own, it doesn't quite fit the same ratios that Roger Unger was working with, 40 years ago. But at the time, I wasn't doing my own research. That talk was just sort of almost a love letter to the work that had been done in the past. past. But it also planted the seed of me wanting to do some of my own projects. But when someone's eating a diet and it's a ketogenic low carb diet, then that insulin to glucagon ratio will only go up to maybe 2 or 3, maybe. It might not even go that high, but we'll see. Once I get all these data together when we finish this cohort of subjects, then I'll have a better idea.
Okay. Yeah. So it's 1 for the fasted state, up to 8 or more. And then we're looking at maybe 2 for the low carb diet. So this is important because we're going to talk about protein, because a lot of people are scared of protein in the keto world. They think it's going to raise their insulin and all this kind of thing. So yeah, explain this part.
That was the beginning of me looking at the insulin to glucagon ratio, because I was so struck by how bizarrely people were committed to just eating as much fat as they could in a way that I considered to be very strange, almost processed in the way it was happening, where they were just eating pure fat. And in nature, that doesn't really happen.
Oh, it's crazy. People are dumping butter and oil in their coffee, and it's
right.
You're not eating whole foods. You're so scared of protein that you're ending up eating processed.
That's exactly right, and that's exactly right. Where I realized, why is everyone so afraid of protein? And again, those are the early days. If I'm no longer in early days now, of my exposure to low carb in the kind of social media realm or the public sphere. And I was just so struck by this fear of protein and how it was creating this very artificial pattern of eating. And so it was based on that work of Roger Unger that I keep mentioning, but finding that protein, the degree to which dietary protein increases insulin, is largely dependent on the underlying amount of glucose, or whether the person has consumed the protein with glucose. Mind you, as happens so often, if it's like a protein shake, there's so often going to be some kind of dextrose or something in there. And indeed, many athletes are looking for that.
Well, steak and potatoes
they want
too.
Yeah, that's right.
Steak
yeah.
and potatoes. Well, this is huge. I want to just highlight this to everyone.
Yes.
It's so huge what you just said. Underlying glucose in the diet.
That's right.
That's right. Affects protein.
That's right. So if insulin is, so if someone's adhering to a low carb diet, there must be this process occurring, and you mentioned it earlier, called gluconeogenesis. In order to maintain normal blood glucose, and it stays normal. I mean, a person can fast for a whole week, and their blood glucose is going to be hovering around 70 to 80 milligrams per deciliter. It doesn't get below that because the liver is making it, and you cannot turn that off. If you turn off gluconeogenesis, in other words, the liver taking in molecules and turning them into glucose and pumping them back into the blood, then you would die in a fasted state. Glucose is necessary in the body for certain cells, and the body makes it. That's why eating it is not essential. So let me clarify, lest someone accuse me of speaking against what I just mentioned. You don't need to eat glucose because the body can make all it needs. The difference between glucose and essential fats and essential amino acids is that the body needs those fats and amino acids, and it cannot make it. In this case, the glucose, which is required for normal homeostasis, some cells need it. The body makes all it needs. So if insulin is high, the liver stops making glucose. In other words, if insulin is elevated, gluconeogenesis stops. So in order to make glucose via gluconeogenesis in a fasted state or a low-carb ketogenic state, you cannot afford to have insulin spike because it would turn off this process that you can't have stopped. And indeed, the data indicate this. The insulin to glucagon ratio barely moves when someone is in a low, if at all, in a low-carb diet. If they eat a bolus of protein, the insulin to glucagon ratio, which is kind of this war of what am I going to do? Am I going to store glucose or am I going to make it, which is what glucagon wants to do, then it doesn't move. In a low-carb state, someone eats protein, they continue to undergo gluconeogenesis. In contrast, if someone has high glucose or they're consuming the protein with glucose, then you do have a substantial insulin spike. The protein will amplify the insulin spike that you'd get from the glucose alone. There is that flip side, but we have to consider the context.
This is huge. And this is what so many vegan doctors don't understand. I watch a lot of vegan videos and try to figure out what they're thinking, and they're not seeing the whole context of this. Right? They're blaming things on protein. Like they do a presentation on why meat's bad. And like, see, look at this, how your insulin rises. It's because of protein. It's like, no, the protein is essential to life. This is a very human thing we've been eating forever, and it has essential amino acids and fatty acids. But without it, in a different context, without the glucose, it doesn't go up. The insulin doesn't go up. And this was so cool when you see this visually. It really clicked for me because I've heard you talk about this before and I kind of understood this, but seeing it that when you're eating a protein bolus without the glucose, then your blood sugar stays the same, and it's because a glucagon goes up.
Yeah. So glucagon, that's right. Glucagon's trying to help the body maintain its ability to, create glucose, to maintain normal fasting glucose levels. Interestingly, I see this, and I guess I just want to correct a bit of a myth, for not that you've said it, but so many people will say that the body will turn the protein or the amino acids from muscle proteins into glucose, and that's the main building block for gluconeogenesis. But the reality actually is the main substrate or molecule building block for gluconeogenesis is lactate, which is coming from the muscle. So the body really has this clever recycling system where lactate's coming from muscle and other cells as well. And then the liver will take that in, and the liver, that is the main source of carbons that the liver will use to create new glucose, just sending it right back into the body to be used again. So lactate is the main gluconeogenic substrate, and these gluconeogenic amino acids, like alanine, they're much, much less than lactate itself is. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside.
Well, that's great. And then also just the fact that it's demand driven is another kind of point.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, you can't force the body to overproduce the glucose that it needs in those states. So it is only done on demand. You're not pushing it as with an excessive supply. Now, interestingly, I kind of skirting around this a moment ago, but one of the benefits of making ketones in a fasted state is that it does start to spare the muscle. Now, despite what I said, lactate being the main source of gluconeogenesis or the main substrate for it, the body will strip muscle to get to the amino acids to use that for new glucose production. That does happen. There's no question. It's just whether it's the main one or not is what I often hear spoken erroneously. But the fact that we start making ketones, it really does spare the muscle because one of the main consumers of glucose is the brain. But of course, the brain can use ketones very readily. And indeed, evidence suggests that the brain prefers ketones to glucose if both are available. So the fact after 24 hours of fasting, the person will have gone through this very brief, maybe between 24 to 48 hours, this very brief and very slight phase of chipping into muscle. And I do mean slight. I mean, this is not like a person's going to notice a loss of muscle, but it's right around the time the ketones come online, if you will, that we then stop being catabolic at the muscle. So if it weren't for our ability to produce ketones, anytime we were fasting, we would start stripping through our muscle. But the fact that we have ketones coming from the fat that we're metabolizing, so we have all that stored body fat. For some reason, the brain does not use fat for fuel, but it uses this fat metabolite, the ketone namely. So we're mobilizing our fat stores. The liver starts turning those fatty acids into ketones, and that feeds the brain. So it's a way for our fat to feed the brain, because the only alternative would be for our muscle to feed the brain. But that's the difference between fasting and starvation. It's the point at which you've run out of fat and now you are catabolizing your own muscle to support the body's fuel needs. The moment the person has run out of fat, now it is starvation. Up until that point, maybe this is semantics, but I would argue that as long as the person has enough body fat to continue to make ketones, then they are fasting, even if it were a ridiculously long time, which I'm not at all advocating. But the difference between a fast and starvation is, do you have enough fat to continue to make ketones to spare your muscle? The moment you start chewing through your muscle to try to meet the body's energetic needs, now you're starving.
Yeah, that makes sense. We got a little bit off track, but then so back to the eating protein in the context of different diets. How do those numbers change?
Yeah. So it really does depend on, is the person eating carbohydrate or not, or the glycemic load of the carbohydrate. Now, I could imagine someone could conceivably, if they were a very, very well-educated vegan who made sure they were somehow making up for all the nutritional deficiencies that are inherent in that diet, if they were doing that and they ate a protein, of course, it will be an inferior source of protein if it's vegan. But If they do that, there will be no real change in the insulin to glucagon ratio. And so whether it's a carnivore diet or a vegan diet, you really just have to come back. I mean, I'm redundant here again, but if the glucose isn't if we need to maintain our own ability to create glucose via gluconeogenesis, the insulin to glucagon ratio cannot afford to change. It would be lethal to the body. And so it doesn't.
Okay, well, do you have new numbers though, just to give the audience idea of how big a difference it is?
No, I don't. I can't remember.
Can't.
I've looked at a couple of these individuals that have come through. I've looked at the data, but until we have a bigger cohort, I don't want to put any firm. I don't want to commit myself to any numbers.
Okay, well, maybe I could talk about the old numbers and just the magnitude of difference, I guess. When you're fasted and you eat some protein, the ratio actually goes down a little.
Yeah. When you are fasted and you eat protein, it could. The insulin generally won't spike, and the glucagon may a bit, and so it could drop from say around 1 to 0.8 if we're sticking with that.
Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not going to be. I mean, that itself is generally fairly modest.
Uh-huh. But the biggest thing is if you're eating like a standard American diet, and then you're eating proteins, it could go like exponential. It could go like a times 10, it seems.
Oh, yeah. It can be an order of magnitude difference. That's right.
Yeah.
As both insulin, because insulin can spike times 10, frankly, but that combined with the fact that glucagon will dip, it really amplifies that ratio.
So that's huge. So it's like a 10x, something like that. But then if in a low carb setting, so say they were at a 2 in their ratio, and then they ate some protein, what would it go to?
Yeah, it won't change.
Won't change. Exactly. No. So it's a huge difference between the context.
Yeah, that's right.
We're talking about no change, and then a standard American diet, it could go up tenfold. So this is, I understand why some of these vegans or some of these like health organizations are trying to say, oh, but meat's bad or protein's bad, because they're looking at it from the completely wrong context.
Yeah, in fact, it goes beyond them. I really resent people trying to throw protein under the bus in the context of longevity and aging. There are these low protein diets that some are claiming are the key to longevity. And I rage against that sentiment, and I consider it absolutely incorrect. The silliness of that perspective
harmful,
is that
I think
it's ridiculous. They're promoting products that sure are low in protein, but they're high in carbohydrate. And what a ridiculous thing to try to say we're going to slow the aging process by eschewing protein. Oh, but we're also giving you most of this macronutrient that increases insulin more than anything else. And we know beyond any doubt, well, I shouldn't say that. In humans, the evidence is always somewhat lacking. Trying to do aging studies in humans is basically impossible. But we know in rodent models and beyond, like fruit flies, worms, rodents, one of the keys to longevity is cut the insulin. If you can lower the insulin response, or if you can lower the insulin so the body's not swimming in a sea of insulin, they will live longer. And so I consider it just a remarkable irony that they're telling people to eat less protein while promoting carbohydrates. And I think that is going to be not even a zero-sum game. That's going to be some negative. That's going to, I would submit, do more harm than good. So I think they are focusing on the wrong macronutrient.
Well, it's insane. That's the macronutrient that promotes the most insulin. It doesn't make any sense. And then, or even mTOR too. You're talking about people are like, mTOR, mTOR for aging. You don't want to, protein's bad for mTOR. No, constant insulin spike's bad for mTOR.
Yep, that's right. In fact, I wasn't going to bring up mTOR because I didn't know whether that would be too much, but you just did. Indeed, if you compare a little slurry of amino acids and what they do to mTOR activation compared with what just insulin does to mTOR activation, it's no comparison. Nothing increases mTOR like insulin does. It is, and there are distinct pathways whereby amino acids can activate mTOR. That's true, and thank heavens for it. Otherwise, what's the point of trying to take protein to help maintain lean mass? But it's remarkable to me if a person is trying to avoid mTOR and yet by reducing protein, but at the same time increasing carbohydrate, that's ridiculous. They are activating mTOR. Nothing activates mTOR as much as insulin does.
It's so crazy. And then, yes, we need more protein as we age too. We
that's
worse.
Right.
It's so not only do we get worse at digesting it, but we also just, it's a great indicator of longevity. It's how strong people are, maintain their strength in old age.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the context of someone who's eschewing any animal products, the person can say, well, I'm going to focus on soy because soy is a complete protein. That's true. And its overall absorbability is very high. It's not like eggs or whey, of course, but it is very good. One of the considerations, though, is that a normal response to exercise in both men and women is to have a transient increase in androgens like testosterone.
Mm-hmm.
That happens, again, in both sexes. You exercise, you will notice the spike in testosterone around an hour to 90 minutes, and then it will ebb back down after about another hour and 90 minutes. When someone takes a whey bolus of protein, it doesn't amplify or reduce that testosterone spike from the exercise. It does nothing to it. When a man takes a soy protein bolus, it completely abolishes that androgen spike from exercise.
Wow.
There's no evidence. I've not seen a study in women on that. I'd be interested to. But in men, it stops it completely.
Well, it's very estrogenic.
It is. And so I don't know if someone's trying to get all their protein. Of course, pea is a very badly absorbable form. It's about half of as absorbable as animal proteins. But yeah, soy is more absorbable, but there are side effects to soy that are absolutely confirmed, certainly in men. And so that is not a protein I want, and I don't want my little boy to take it either, frankly.
Definitely not. Well, soy is a nightmare. So why don't we take a detour then and talk about muscle gain and stuff like that? Because you did have that background. And also, it's really interesting to me. Yeah, I want to maintain muscle. I want to build muscle, but I don't want to eat a bunch of carbs. And there's this whole model of bodybuilding for the past. I mean, I don't want to be a bodybuilder at all. But there's this whole model in the bodybuilding world of you need carbs to build muscle.
Yeah, and it looks more and more that is just not the case. There have been limited research. There are just a few papers on this. I am treading lightly here, but there is no evidence so far. I think there's only one study I've seen looking at power performance or power output. Then now there are several looking at endurance, and there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest there is an adaptation deficit in the context of low-carb ketogenic. So the idea that you need glucose and that subsequent insulin spike to really be anabolic at the muscle, that idea appears to be pretty poorly justified. Whereas it really is a matter of what is the stimulus? Is there stimulus exhaustion? So if someone is really serious about getting big, muscle gains at least, they need to go to failure.
Absolutely.
Essentially all the time. And other than that, they need to make sure they're getting a lot of protein and a lot of calories, because building muscle is energetically expensive. You have to really provide fuel for the body. And I would submit fat is a perfectly viable fuel there. And the limited evidence would support that. The idea that you have to have this insulin spike to promote muscle gains is absolutely not true. Insulin is always present, and it appears that insulin just appears to inhibit. It manifests as an anti-catabolic effect, which it can do at very low levels. And so insulin will just, rather than being anabolic at the muscle, it appears to just be anti-catabolic, which is not necessarily the same thing. It just kind of helps defend the muscle rather than actually building it up. And again, it does not have to have a big bump to do that.
Yeah, well, this is perfect because I talked to Keith Barr who laid this out, and he's so great. And well, maybe I could ask you about this. So, the difference between like kind of lean gains or bulking and cutting, right? I was kind of thinking about this because I was like, yeah, I know people who bulk and cut, and it takes, say, over the course of 6 months, you bulk and then you cut. Would you just get to the same point if you just did lean gains for 6 months?
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking. But again, as a scientist, I want to be careful because I don't know of any data to support that perspective. But when a person is bulking, from what I understand, they're basically just saying, I'm going to eat whatever I want. And I know that means, and because I'm working out like a machine, I'm going to be gaining muscle. And if I'm gaining a little bit of fat, so be it. But all that means is you've devoted energy to storage when you should have been promoting it towards working on gaining the muscle. I mean, there's no point to that. There's no bioenergetic or energy rationale to saying, by storing energy as fat, I'm going to help my muscle get big. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
There's no rationale. I mean, it defies reason to try to think of it
seems
that
the
way.
opposite.
So, yeah, what I suspect is some hint of truth is that they are just eating enough calories to support the growth. And that's part of the benefit of that bulking phase. They're just being really liberal with their calories, which again, you kind of have to do. But if you were doing it liberally in a low carb state, I submit that you likely would not compromise your muscle gains. All you would do is simply say, fat, I'm not giving you any of it because insulin is low enough to not let that happen.
Yeah, and just give it all the muscle. And I think some of it, I think people just, it's visual, right? If you're crushing like all kinds of weird whey proteins and Pop-Tarts or whatever these people do to bulk, you think you're getting huge because you're getting fat at the same time, right? It's like, oh, look how big I am.
That's
like,
right.
because no, you're just getting a lot of fat and you're getting some muscle. So it just seems slower to just try to put on the muscle without all that excess fat.
Yeah, that I was looking at it the same way.
It's visual, right? It's like,
that's right.
Like
yeah, in
head.
fact, there is I once heard this really remarkable interview or podcast. I can't remember where I heard it, but the guy was going through a timeline of professional bodybuilders and scrutinizing the physique of the bodybuilders. And he suggests, I mean, nowadays, if you look at one of these competitive bodybuilders, often they will have very balloon-like bellies. You know, they'll have a very bulging belly. Sure, there's a six-pack on top of it, but it's a bulging belly, as opposed to the old bodybuilders like Arnold and Lou Ferrigno, where they were extremely lean. I mean, very cut down at the waist and no ballooning of the belly whatsoever. He kind of made the case that it was all due to the abuse of insulin as an anabolic hormone, that up until that point, when it really was just the androgens that were being abused as anabolic hormones, there was none of this ballooning of the belly.
Was that like visceral fat or like?
Well, exactly. Yeah. Yes, that's the thought, is that when these guys, now that they're abusing insulin as well, it's not like they're getting really bigger, or maybe they are a bit, but they're also apparently getting a little fatter, certainly viscerally, where the belly is really ballooning out. And there was a lot of speculation in that. So I'm stating that, I'm kind of reciting that carefully without too much authority, but it is hard to ignore. Modern bodybuilders do have a bulging belly that did not exist, 30 years ago.
Yeah, it can't be good. Okay, I'm trying to jump back around because we took this detour. Maybe we could get back to carnitine, because that is to do with muscle and also to do with the insulin to glucagon ratio. Yeah,
that's right. Well, I brought up carnitine as kind of it was meant to sort of be a bit of a cheeky aside when I brought that up first time, simply because in order to make ketones, you have to get the fat molecule into the mitochondria to be oxidized or burned, if you will. So as you burn the fat, you come to a molecule that you have a choice. You either commit to burning that molecule all the way to carbon dioxide, in other words, like burning it to nothing, or you don't burn it all the way and you shift it into the production of a ketone. In order to get the ketone, you have to take the fat into the mitochondria and burn it. In order to get the fat into the mitochondria, it basically has to be ushered in by a molecule called carnitine. Carnitine, if you will, kind of takes the fat by the arm and walks it into the mitochondria. It's an essential transporter. And so if you are genuinely carnitine deficient, which is not going to be something that happens very readily, but I could conceive of it. Exactly. I could conceive of it happening in a vegan situation, especially if it's a ketogenic vegan diet, because where you're burning a lot of fat to make ketones and you're not eating any carnitine, the body's ability to make carnitine could conceivably be passed. Nevertheless, at that point, in that talk, when I mentioned it, I just thought it was kind of a funny way to bring up the fact that if you're focusing on protein and fat and carnitine in order to maintain a good insulin to glucagon ratio and even indeed be ketogenic, then there's nothing better than a piece of red meat, because it is made of protein and fat, and this, of course, is enriched with carnitine.
I love that. And okay, speaking of being in ketosis, so I talked to Chris Masterjohn recently, really smart researcher, and then I'm friends with Paul Saladino, so I kind of know they're having like a little debate thing going on, and apparently they're doing a part 2 because Chris thinks that it's bad to be in ketosis, which is super weird. I thought he was kind of on the same page on all this.
Yeah, I would have a hard time. I would want to know how someone's justifying that. because I don't know. I've spoken with Paul before. I've never spoken with Chris, but I understand him to be a nutrient biochemist, kind of similar to my ilk in a way. But I don't know how someone could defend being in ketosis is unhealthy long term. I'd be interested in seeing what data he's basing that on. And I suspect it's not based on anything. Or if it is, it's based on these anachronistic studies from early childhood epilepsy studies where decades ago, in order to keep a child in ketosis, they would do very high protein, very low fat,
No,
low carb,
opposite.
and no,
Oh.
in the original
really?
in the original ketogenic diets for children with epilepsy, it was very high protein and water restricted.
Oh, weird.
And that is a bit of a bizarre situation
Yeah.
that certainly could be harmful to the kidneys, because if most of your calories are coming from protein, you have got to clear out a remarkable amount of nitrogen, and that turns into urea, which of course one of the main components of urine. And if you're also water restricted, then that makes it harder to clear that urea out. And so there can be consequences of the kidneys, but those were poorly formed versions of the ketogenic diet. And if he is making that assumption based on those data, then I would say that is he's off base.
Mm-hmm. What else would he be based on? Everything else shows that it's
that's
better.
right. Yeah. But I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to assume anything about him. I don't know him at all. But I don't believe that. I would need to see some data to suggest it, and I'm quite certain it does not exist.
Yeah. Okay. Brown fat and white fat is super interesting to me. You know tons about it. I know it's super interesting to you.
Yeah, it sure is.
Let's go in.
Yeah, so that was my very first foray into the low carb kind of space publicly, and I was just delighted at how eager everyone was to hear this. So we know, I'm comfortable saying that now, if someone is in ketosis because insulin is low, their metabolic rate is higher. Even anti-low carb people have shown this. Kevin Hall published this paper in a very well-controlled study. David Ludwig showed a more dramatic effect of metabolic rate being about 3 times higher when someone was on a low-carb diet. But we know if you give a type 1 diabetic insulin, their metabolic rate will drop by about 15 to 20%. We know that. That has been known for 100 years almost. In fact, almost probably exactly about 100 years at this point. So we know insulin slows metabolic rate, and we know that ketones have this limited ability to accelerate metabolic rate. This was based on an animal study that I had seen, that phenomenon, and we've now confirmed, well, I shouldn't say confirmed because we haven't published yet. It's just taking a bloody long time to get this published. But we've confirmed tentatively this effect in humans. I'll say confirmed once it's published. We've tentatively confirmed this effect in humans, that we're in ketosis or not, and then scrutinizing the degree to which the mitochondria are working. So the fundamental difference between brown fat and white fat, well, I guess there are 2 differences. Brown fat, which all humans have at least a limited amount of, is enriched with mitochondria. So it physically looks darker in color, brown, if you will, as opposed to the kind of the whitish, yellowish fat that most of us have around our bodies, the white fat. So it not only has a lot more mitochondria, but these mitochondria really behave very differently. And in particular, we use the mitochondria sort of 2 functional things, more than that, to be fair to the mitochondria, but with regards to just this conversation, 2 main things. One is that it will utilize a system called the electron transport system in order to create this tension with regards to protons. So the electron transport system is a way of getting nutrients. As we think about breaking down fats and glucose, we're getting to these molecules that feed this electron transport system. And the purpose of that is to pump protons out of the mitochondria. And it creates this tension, almost like you're about to make a static shock, where we've made a bit of a charge differential now by pumping out the protons, the positively charged protons, and not the negatively charged electrons along with the protons. So just the protons being pumped. And the mitochondria has this ingenious mechanism to allow the protons to come back in, which they want to do, going kind of down this concentration gradient, going downhill, if you will. And this is an important word. We couple that process to utilize that. We kind of hijack that downhill movement of the protons to create this necessary molecule called ATP. And that, again, I'm going to use this word again, we've coupled those processes. We've coupled electron transport to what's called oxidative phosphorylation, or the actual creation of an ATP molecule. And we need ATP. A cell needs ATP to work, whether it's pumping out electrons, whether it's engaging in muscle contraction and relaxation, the heart as well, the diaphragm for breathing, whether it's helping a nerve conduct its impulse down the length of the neuron. We need ATP to do a lot of this stuff. In the case of the brown fat, we have uncoupled those two processes. So we are still going through the electron transport aspect of it, and we're still taking nutrient pieces to feed that. And yet we allow those protons, once pumped out, we allow them to pump back in without coupling it to the production of ATP. So we're not getting any ATP. We're not getting the cellular work, but we are still working. The cell is still busy. And so that creates the situation where, normally you're only going to use as much energy as your body needs. That in that case, it's demand driven. You exercise and your metabolic rate has gone up. But in this case, brown fat allows you, if brown fat is active, your metabolic rate has gone up and you're still just sitting there watching TV. That's one of the interesting aspects of brown fat, is a very metabolically active fat and represents a way to kind of just waste energy, if you will. We found that ketones basically turn that on, that process on. So if you expose white fat to ketones, it will help turn those white fat cells into brown fat. They start to act a little more like brown fat cells. In contrast, if you expose brown fat cells to high levels of insulin, it turns off that uncoupling and makes the brown fat cells start to behave more like white fat cells. And we did publish those data, so I can say that with authority. Insulin turns off that mitochondrial uncoupling, and ketones turn it on.
That's so cool. And so they waste energy as heat. So these brown fat, they kind of just produce more heat. And how do you, babies start with a lot of brown fat. I know that. And then you can build brown fat with like cold therapy, right?
Yeah, that's right. So cold therapy can activate brown fat and even presumably expand it. But also what we're finding is the ketones do it too. So if someone says, I don't want to sit in an ice bath, or I don't want to have ice cold showers. Well, if you still want to kind of take advantage, exploit that metabolic advantage, just get into ketosis, and it apparently is eliciting some of the same effects.
Well, that's amazing, because there was a study. It was actually October of last year. I just looked it up. The David Ludwig study that showed this metabolic advantage in a very low carb diet. He had some other studies before that they showed this, right? In different.
Yes.
And so do people accept this? I remember this was a year ago. I talked to Lane Norton, one of these guys that are just like calories in, calories out, and like everything's equal. And
it's such a silly perspective. And in all due respect to Lane, and I do mean that sincerely, I do think he's really made some neat contributions to our understanding of anabolism at muscles. But the people who want to claim that it's just as simple as calories in, calories out, adhere to the first law of thermodynamics, that energy is not created or destroyed. But the moment they do that, they have to acknowledge the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy, that things will seek chaos. And chemically speaking, chaos is inefficiency. And inefficiency, bioenergetically speaking, means a waste of energy or a waste of calories. And that's all we're seeing here. So to try to, and it's assuming all kinds of things, that digestion is identical, that the thermic effect of the food is identical. And we know that all of these things are absolutely not
or
equal
hormones
across all the macronutrients.
Yeah, different.
And indeed, if we take it to what we were just saying all the way, the effect on hormones. And hormones control energy. I would never claim, I won't say a calorie isn't a calorie. I'm not going to say that. But trying to apply the realm of thermodynamics, which was born in the context of physical and mathematical sciences. In other words, physics.
Like a steam engine.
That is a principle. Yes, that is a principle of physics. Yeah. And to try to apply that to a biological organism is frankly silly and dangerous potentially, or not dangerous, but just silly. We have to acknowledge that an organism, a biological organism, is more complicated. And I submit much of that complication revolves around the relevance of hormones. Hormones dictate what the body does with the energy that it has consumed, whether it is more inclined to store it, which insulin will do. And of course, if you want the body to store energy, you can help that happen by reducing metabolic rate, which insulin does. There's no debating that. And in contrast, if insulin is low, the body has to be using energy. And if the person's in a state of using energy, but also eating like a ketogenic diet, then to me, it makes a certain amount of sense that the body is given this signal, all right, I'm supposed to be mobilizing my energy. I'm supposed to be using it. And yet the actual metabolic demand is only so high. But because I can't store it, because insulin isn't high enough to let me, I'm going to waste some of it. And so I'm going to increase mitochondrial uncoupling, and I'm going to just be breathing out and urinating out ketones.
Yes.
And when someone appreciates that a ketone is simply a piece of fat that either has to be stored or burned for energy, now we've introduced this other option of wasting it. Like literally, if someone's detecting ketones on their breath or in their urine, they are wasting energy. I mean, almost as if they were, breathing out glucose or peeing out glucose. You're wasting energy, and that's what's happening if someone's in ketosis. So to try to say, eating a same amount of calories from Twinkies or Pop-Tarts as opposed to a steak, that's silly. Let's just see what happens long term in such a situation. I know that's a bit dramatic, but yeah, I mean, with all due respect to these other scientists, to try to invoke the first law of thermodynamics with no regard to the second, which is that nature will sort of seek an inefficiency, that's insincere, I think, or uninformed.
Yeah, I think it's crazy. And I don't know why people are so scared of high fat, low carb diets. And like, I understand that other diets can work, but we're talking about what is optimal, like what is evolutionary accurate,
Yeah.
what is,
Yeah.
how you can be fast easier. There's so many benefits. So, and you apparently you waste more energy and you're more metabolically active on this high fat diet, and it feeds your brain with the ketones. Like there's so many benefits. So people wonder why low carb people are kind of get so fired up about it. It's because it's so awesome in so many ways, and that it's just better. I'm not saying that you can't achieve the same results. Like you said, you can achieve the same results using different dietary patterns, but there's just one that's better than the other.
Yeah, especially, I mean, one of the reasons I guess I'm vocal about it, if I am, and I suppose I am, it's because the other side won't acknowledge a benefit.
Yes.
They want to just pretend that there is no benefit. And I find that if I have to be a voice that counters their voice, I want someone to hear me state this with a great degree of conviction, if not volume. But if I have to be loud about it in the way I'm presenting it, the content that I'm presenting, well, then I will, because there are going to be many, many voices. Indeed, the majority of voices are going to try to drown me out. And my response to them is simply going to be always, show me the data. If someone is claiming that a low-carb diet is dangerous or unsustainable, show me the data. If someone's claiming that saturated fat should be no more than 10% of calories, like the dietary recommendations, show me the data. Show me, in fact, one single study that number is based on.
Yeah.
And all you'll hear is crickets chirping. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So I try to be diplomatic in how I address when people have an opinion that's contrary to mine. And if they do have any inkling of data to support it, I will nod my head and kind of give them that, kind of a hat tip. But I also hope they'll pay me the same respect and acknowledge that not a single thing I have said during this interview has been my opinion. I'm stating these things with an authority because I know there are studies that I can use to back up what I'm saying. If I'm in a court of law, I can provide my own defense. And that's important to me as a scientist. I can't really rely on anecdotes. Many of the physicians can. And in a way, I kind of envy that ability where they can just say, you know what, you can take all those data and shove it, because I have just seen 1,000 patients get off their medications and lose 100 pounds. And there's nothing you can say to have me unsee that. I mean, a physician can speak with a very different authority when they have seen what's happening with their patients. I can't. I have to rely on the data, which is its own kind of authority. And we each are going to use the tools we have. But if a scientist is trying to claim that the human body is a perfect thermodynamic machine, or that ketosis is dangerous long-term, I'm cynical, partly because I don't believe the data support that perspective.
Yeah, I love that. And it's great that these doctor anecdotes of people getting off their medications are from low carb diets too. So we do have the anecdotes, right. We do have the science, we do have evolution, we have everything. Okay, so one more thing. I'm really interested in the personal fat threshold. And there's like different models of kind of diabetes, or it's like, right, you have the carbohydrate insulin model, and then you have this kind of, are they really at odds, or can they exist together? And can you kind of lay it out?
Oh, no, I don't think they're at odds. Yeah, I don't think they're at odds at all. Indeed, to me, it's part of it's a progression. So regardless of how the person were to get there, in fact, we don't even need to invoke the carbohydrate insulin theory of obesity or the thermodynamic, or we don't need to invoke the endocrine or caloric theories of obesity to get to the personal fat threshold. The idea of the personal fat threshold, which I don't love that terminology, partly because I fear that someone would hear that and think, oh, well, I'm just determined to be fatter than someone else, or I am just determined to be leaner. I'm genetically more lean or fatter. I just worry sometimes that the semantics of that term may be somewhat confusing. But the idea behind the personal fat threshold is that a person will have a certain situation that will be partly genetic and partly environmental, and that is important to note, the environmental aspect, lest someone just throw up their hands in despair. But this combination of genetics and environment, and specifically what they're eating, it will promote fat tissue to grow in either a good way or a bad way. And the bad way is when they've reached their threshold. But it's almost, we say threshold, it's like kind of we're looking at it from the perspective of the whole body, but that's not necessarily the best way. We have to look at it from the perspective of the fat cell. And if a fat cell is getting loaded, which it will only do if insulin is elevated, otherwise it will not be taking in fat to store it, but let alone making fat from glucose, which it can do to a limited degree. Most of glucose turning to fat would happen at the liver, and then the fat cell would take up that fat to store. But suffice it to say, if a fat cell reaches a point of being full, or it has reached its threshold, it cannot really grow anymore, and it becomes insulin resistant, because it's basically telling the body, or telling insulin, you want me to keep growing, but I cannot. I have reached my threshold, and so I'm going to become insensitive to you. I cannot listen to you anymore. And whereas you want me to continue to store energy, I cannot help but start leaking it. And so two things start to come from that overstuffed fat cell that has met its threshold. It starts leaking fatty acids, and it starts releasing pro-inflammatory proteins, kind of like the ones the very ones I was mentioning at the very beginning of our time from the fat cell. So the combination of the release of fat means that the fat could potentially start getting stored or otherwise metabolized into other more dangerous types of fats, like a type of fat called ceramides, which is a whole other topic. But so the fat will start to get stored throughout the body and potentially add things more dangerous. Yeah. That's right, ectopic. So we're storing fat where we're not supposed to, just like an ectopic pregnancy is you're growing a fetus where you're not supposed to, somewhere outside the uterus. So ectopic, anytime it's just not where it should be. So pushing all this fat out of your fat cells, it's leaking fat cells, and you're promoting inflammation. That is a remarkable combination, because inflammation and fat create this perfect storm of inducing insulin resistance throughout the rest of the body. And so the personal fat threshold is simply that idea. And to kind of summarize, that a fat cell has reached its limit, it becomes insulin resistant to prevent basically from exploding, if you will, I guess. In that context, it starts leaking fat and leaking pro-inflammatory proteins or cytokines. And that then probably creates the liver to turn insulin resistant next, and then the muscles. And then once you have your fat, liver, and your muscles, you're hosed.
Yeah.
You are insulin resistant, and everything's going to start going wrong.
Well, and this is why people can be slimmer and still have insulin resistance. Like maybe in the Asian cultures, they still have problems and strokes. And
that's right. That's right.
Obese.
That's right. In contrast, why you can have someone who is obese and yet metabolically healthy, as bizarre as that sounds, where if you were to measure their inflammation and measure their insulin, you'd find that they're both very, very good levels. It's because their fat cells are growing through a process of hyperplasia. So rather than each individual fat cell getting very big, they are multiplying. And so there's just a lot more fat cells, but each one of them is perfectly content to hold the modest amount of fat that it's holding. That is a healthy way to grow fat. And indeed, there is a genetic, in this case, ethnic predisposition. And I like to joke that if you want to be really fat, you want to be Caucasian. It appears that Caucasians will, Northern Europeans, if we're being more accurate, that ethnicity, that descent line will generally grow fat through hyperplasia. Not always, of course. And you can see the differences. If someone has fat that is like loose and hanging, that's generally, and it's squishy, that's typically fat growing through hyperplasia. If it is hard, then it is fat through hypertrophy. And indeed, most other ethnicities, certainly Asian ethnicities, as you mentioned, and I saw this very readily in my time in Singapore in particular as a postdoctoral fellow, these are individuals who don't get fat in a healthy way. So just a modest amount of fat gain. The fat cells have really reached their limit quite early and quite quickly, and they will start to experience the metabolic ramifications like insulin resistance at a very lower level. So their fat threshold is much lower.
Doesn't that make sense kind of evolutionarily and geographically, where people, you're talking about Northern European Caucasians, we're up in the north, and it would be advantageous for us to be able to create more fat cells just to stay warmer even, and then closer to the equator where it seems like more people have this TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside.
Yeah. I've kind of made that case before. I've mentioned that sort of idea, but I don't know how, I don't know how well that idea holds up with a little bit of scrutiny, but on the surface, it makes some sense.
Okay, cool. Well, how does that go at odds with the carbohydrate insulin model? Like even Dr. Ted Nyman, who's the man, I love him. Everyone loves him in our little world, but he's I heard him say the carbohydrate insulin model is dead. What is he talking about?
I don't know. Actually, I know Ted personally and really like him and respect him. I'm not sure what he would mean by that. I know Ted is a little more agnostic or indifferent, or maybe to use one more word, a bit wary of the endocrine model of obesity that I embrace much more readily than he does. But I know he is a low-carb advocate, whether he says it as much, but he's certainly a protein. Yeah. He's a protein
For
advocate
sure, protein too.
With his protein to energy ratio, which I think has some value. But I don't know what Ted would be thinking in that regard, but that is not the same as the personal fat threshold.
Well, yeah, how are those at odds, or are they combined? Not at odds.
I don't believe they are. To me, it is, you would first ask the question, how is a fat cell growing? And you either answer that through the caloric theory of obesity or through the endocrine theory, which you're saying is the carbohydrate insulin. I just use endocrine to cut out some syllables. So whether it's the caloric theory of obesity or the endocrine theory of obesity, one of those is going to get you to fat cells that are growing. So the personal fat threshold is downstream of the first question, which is how's the fat cell growing? And if we just say, well, it's one of those two, caloric or endocrine, I actually espouse both, just simply because I believe the endocrine theory accounts for the caloric theory through the mechanisms we mentioned earlier with uncoupling and wasting, which reconciles this apparent caloric deficit. But regardless, once the fat cell starts to grow, then the personal fat threshold is the theory to describe why it goes to illness. So if we say the body gets fat, the fat cells get sick, and then the body becomes insulin resistant, as this progression, the personal fat threshold is trying to mediate between the last two steps, how the body gets fat and why it becomes insulin resistant. And so if someone's claiming that the personal fat threshold is at odds with the endocrine or the caloric theory of obesity, I don't think they're looking at it correctly.
Well, okay, so how do people who eat high carb diets, maybe you can explain this, how do they consume high amounts of insulin but not get fat? Like if you're doing it in the correct context, like some people formulate a healthy high carb diet.
Yeah. So it would have to simply be carbohydrates that are very relatively low starch per nutrient consumed. So, well, basically it's any real fruit and vegetable, at the risk of oversimplifying it, where if the person, that's right. So if a person's eating a salad drizzled with olive oil or avocado oil, that's a very different, I don't know what would their protein source be? I don't know, tofu maybe, fermented, whatever, soy. So if whatever their protein source is going to be, that is going to be very different from them eating an isocaloric amount of some other vegetarian friendly food like a Pop-Tart or something. So I would just presume that's how they're doing it. And I don't personally know any vegan ketogenic people, but I know they're out there. I've seen them on social media, and they're somewhat a curiosity for me, but with nothing but respect, because they have varying reasons for it. And if someone's reason is that they have a genuine adverse response to animal products, just some sensitivity, all right, or if there's a moral reason for them, I can appreciate that. I really can. But if it's because they're claiming it's healthier, I don't have any respect for that.
Yeah.
None whatsoever.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. I have one more minute here. I want to throw a curveball at you because I'm interested in, I went to the conference recently and it was all about this fake meat and, future is vegan and fake meat and the whole thing, the cell-based meat. And I heard you talking about creating fat cells in Petri dishes. Do you think we'll ever be able to technologify food where we don't need animals? Well, I think animals are very necessary, ruminant animals, for the land and the soil health. A whole nother story there. But do you think we can outsmart nature when it comes to all these omega-3s and short-chain fatty acids and this and that?
Yeah. One of the things about, so that lab-grown meat, which isn't the same as like the Never or the Impossible Burger or whatever, where there's no meat whatsoever, but those are just a horrific cocktail of all kinds of artificial.
Slop,
yeah, exactly. But if we were going to say this is meat, it's just lab-grown, in order to grow those kinds of like muscle cells and fat cells and merge that together, you have to use a ridiculous amount of antibiotics. For example, just like the low-hanging fruit, and people are worried about their antibiotics in their cattle. No, we're looking at like orders of magnitude, 1,000 times higher doses of antibiotics to grow those muscle cells and fat cells in a culture, in a lab. Not to mention that I don't think we could ever truly replicate the countless molecules that are in meat from an animal that is eating what nature designed it to eat, grass, in the case of cattle. I just don't think you could, even if we spiked it with omega-3s, which they're not going to inherently make on their own, if we spike in some omega-3s and if we spike in a more full variety of like B vitamins and, K, all the fat soluble vitamins, you would have to spike those things in. And I doubt we could get it as right as just the meat has it on its own. So I don't think we can scientifically replicate what nature or grand, or God created as the optimal way for eating.
Yeah, that's just my intuition as well. It just seems it's too complicated.
It is, and it's filthy, dirty stuff, and resource intensive too. I mean, if someone's doing this because they don't want to damage the earth, no, I mean, they need to come into a lab and just see how much energy is being used in a lab to try to grow. I mean, what would just be a modest-sized hamburger patty?
Exactly.
I mean, it would be ridiculous.
That's what I'm saying. All right, I've picked your brain enough. Thank you so much. You're on Twitter. Where can we find you?
Yeah. So I am active on Twitter and Instagram. In both instances, it's Ben Bikman, PhD. Yeah, and that's my purpose there is just simply to promote the awareness of actual just published science. I'm never posting pictures of myself. It's not me or what I'm eating. I just don't want to do that kind of thing. I don't want to get into that. But it is just science. It's just data.
I love it. And I'll post some more of your science as it comes out. I'm excited for...
Sounds great. Well, I appreciated the time, Brian. This was a good conversation.
All right. Thank you so much. I'll let you get back to it.
All right. Thanks, brother. See ya.
Man, I wish we had some more time, but he had a hard out and I pushed it to the last minute. Maybe I can have him back on at some point. Please hit that 5-star rating on the Apple Podcast app if you enjoyed the show. It actually will help, and it might be the easiest thing to do to show your support. Get your nose to tail meat at nosetail.org. Check out Sapien and the programs we offer at sapien.org/programs. And see you next week. Stay happy and healthy, my friends.